Good afternoon, and welcome to another sessions of RCA's Industry IQ. I am Matt Stavish, joined by my colleague Isaac Ellsworth. Today, we're joined by Mike Countessy of CAVU Advisors. Mike, thank you for joining us. Help us understand why we need to listen to your industry IQ. What do you have to bring to the table?
Hi, Matt. First, I'd like to thank you all very much for bringing us in on this Industry IQ. CAVU Advisors, as you know, is a financial accounting outsourcing firm for government contractors, and we go above and beyond the transactional accounting to really help clients with dynamic forecasting. And that's really what we're talking about bringing to the table today, is talking about that advice and strategic forecasting for contractors as they're growing.
Thank you. That's a great segue. Government contracting is really unique because so many people can get started very quickly because they work with their current customers, either a billable or they're employed at a big and then they start their own firm. So what would be the best piece of advice you could give a firm that's just getting started?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I want to talk to a firm about when they're getting started is surround yourself with the right advisors from the get-go. That's both accounting, your tax and audit team, and then your bank and financing team as well. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is, especially from an accounting perspective, is they're a growing GovCon, is they may be using an all-in-one bookkeeping firm around the corner from them. But as you grow, especially when you need the compliance aspect with the FAR and things of that nature, you need a good, well-rounded accounting outsourcing team, and then also a separate tax and audit team that can audit that work and give you tax strategy advice as you grow. And as we talk about that from a compliance perspective and a tactical standpoint, I would also advise companies that they need to be setting themselves up with a DCAA chart of accounts that's compliant to start with. Understand what it means to be compliant and also how to comply with the federal acquisition regulations. If you're using QuickBooks, for example, as your software, make sure you're then also using a timekeeping system that will allow you to be government compliant.
Thanks, Mike. And kind of going with that, we talked about forecasting, how important revenue forecasting is. And sometimes companies may not know what they don't know. So what are some things you see in revenue forecasting that the companies get wrong that CAVU actually gets right?
Well, thanks, Isaac. So there's actually a lot to unpack here with this comment. So I'll take this in pieces. The first thing is we don't see a lot of times that companies are doing their revenue forecasting from the bottom up. You really need to understand all of your expenses, your contracts, your people, and make sure that you're looking at all those variables as you're building your forecast from the bottom up. And another thing is being able to retool that forecast month over month. I talk with owners a lot of times and as they get started with us, and some of them like, well, I've got my forecast in my head, or I know what that is. And it really sometimes boils down to actually being a baseline budget, not a living, breathing forecast. And that's something that we like to work with the clients on, is retooling that forecast month over month, considering all the variables, new contract award wins. What could happen if I win this piece of business out here? What is that going to do to my cash flow, my indirect rates? Can I hire some support personnel to help me with that growth? Those are things that you do need to look at that. There are systems like Uninet that actually allow you to forecast your people out against your contracts and really look at things, just make sure you're properly utilizing everybody. A lot of companies have challenges hiring right now. So sometimes it's even good practice to think about, if you are hiring somebody or in the process of recruiting, they may not start in 30 days. It may be 60 or 90. And looking at those scenarios and retooling and looking at your forecast in different ways to make sure that you've accounted for all the variables and what that impact is going to be to your financial metrics. We always like to preach, plan conservatively and run scenarios when you can based on the contracts that you have in hand. It's really important to do that. Building up a forecast with a lot of what if and potential wins that don't have high confidence is not always advisable, because you're going to kind of be backpedaling throughout the year to kind of pick up, okay, well, what do I do now? This didn't come in. What do I do now? It's always better to plan conservatively and then have to plan around that additional business and growing versus the alternative.
Mike, speaking of growth, and last question, and this is a tough one for small businesses, federal acquisition is moving to more IDIQ vehicles, and that is making a little bit more difficult for firms to have a quality forecast. What advice can you give for the firms that have the IDIQ vehicles, the right to fight, if you will, contracts and help improve the quality of the forecasting so that they don't outspend their budgets just going after task orders because they felt like they need to on those big vehicles.
Right. That's a great question, Matt. And I think that also kind of plays off the last comment I made is have those scenarios built where you have different P wins and what that looks like and what that impact is going to be. Don't just plan on that IDIQ being a kind of a never-ending source of work, but actually plan, if I win this TO or I go after this, what is the impact going to be? Generally, when you're building out a forecast, it's better to plan your expenses around that more conservative look and adjust when you know the new work is coming in, and rather than assuming a ton of new business is going to come in the door. You may have a threshold to perform certain outlooks and different P-win scenarios. So again, that's really what we would stress here. Really poke holes and probe your scenarios and what builds them up. We all want to look at a forecast and give it our best shot and be super optimistic. There's nothing wrong with working like with us to probe those and make sure that things are realistic and that they make sense, and what happens if this doesn't happen or this does. That's really the piece of advice is don't settle. Make sure you run all the scenarios in your head. And then one last piece of advice I'll leave you with is, have a good grasp on contract waterfalls. It's one of the most critical tools for, evaluating exit planning, and being able to report on your contracts on hand is important. And this is going to get a critical eye during that evaluation.
That's great. That's a great overview of what CAVU does and the importance of GovCons, no matter how big you are, of having very accurate forecasts and various metrics to evaluate. I want to thank Mike Canalzi with CAVU Advisors for joining us. I am Matt Stavish, joined by my colleague Isaac Ellsworth at Republic Capital Access, and that's another Industry IQ in the books.